What's up everybody? Nate here. So the war between Russia and Ukraine has pretty much disrupted every single economy and market across the world. And even though we are only 2 weeks into this conflict, there has been so many lives that have been lost and tragedies that have happened in Ukraine. With all that being said, the United States and countries around the world have condemned Russia, and they have even put serious economic sanctions on the country, which has crippled the Russian economy. And even after all that, it looks like things are continuing to escalate in Ukraine with no real end in sight. That has a lot of Americans and experts and investors asking, how is this conflict going to end? Well, that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I saw this article over on CNBC that basically says, how will Russia's war with Ukraine end? Here are 5 possible outcomes. I want to kind of give my reaction to what is going on here and some of the topics that they discuss in the article. Because at some point, we know that it needs to end. However, some endings are a lot more likely than others. And no matter how it ends, this is going to have some serious impacts on not only the US economy, but worldwide economies and how they function every day. But before I get into all of that, do me a quick favor and smash that thumbs up button below and ring that notification bell too. Both of those 2 things are completely free and they help to show me that you like this video and that you want to see even more just like it. But thank you so much for doing that. But now let's talk about the 5 possible outcomes from the war between Russia and Ukraine. Number 1, the first thing that this article talks about is patchy control from the Russian government. Now this war in Ukraine is fluid, which means it's rapidly adapting and changing every single day. That means that control is switching every single day from the Ukraine government to the Russian government. Well, if this war actually continues for the long term, we're talking several more months here and even years, experts largely believe that this will lead to partial control from the Russian government. This would mean that Russia controls some parts of Ukraine, but not the entire country. They would basically set up their own pro-Russian government in those areas. Now, it's really difficult to tell if those areas would actually become part of Russia, but what it means from an economic standpoint is that Russia gets a lot of the resources that Ukraine puts out. For instance, during this whole Russia-Ukraine war, Russia has pretty much made it a point to take all of Ukraine's nuclear power centers. Now, for the war perspective, this allows them to cut off Ukraine's resources. However, if they continue to keep control of that, then they could reallocate those resources to Russia. More nuclear power plants, which means less cost for Russian citizens when it comes to their energy. And of course, to the Russian government. This would cripple Ukraine even further because now they're not able to supply their citizens with enough power, or their government. And all of those industries that run out of Ukraine are also not going to have the power to survive. Now, patchy control from Russia would basically mean it's impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, which is part of the reason why Russia is invading Ukraine in the first place. They don't want a NATO country so close to their borders. And with pro-Russian governments all throughout the country of Ukraine, well, they're definitely not going to be able to join NATO. What this also means is people who do not want to see Russia take over Ukraine are going to flee. In fact, at the moment, we've already seen around 5 to 10 million refugees leave the country. They're going to take their resources and any wealth that they have and knowledge over to other countries. And these countries are going to have a lot more Ukrainian influence. So that could ultimately lead to a pretty big cultural shift in Europe. Now, the second thing that we need to discuss here is a purge and partition. This is a little more complicated because instead of patchy control, so Russia actually controlling a few square miles of the country, this would be a complete split. Russia would take the eastern portion of Ukraine and the rest of Ukraine would remain on the western parts. In this situation, I think you would also have a big refugee problem because now anybody that's on the side of Ukraine that is now going to become part of Russia is gonna wanna leave and go over to Ukraine. Russia's not really going to like that, so they're going to stop that from happening at all costs. And while that could mean that Ukraine gets smaller, Ukraine will still be around and it might still have a chance to salvage its country and rebuild. Of course, it would be a lot different and it's going to be a lot more difficult than when this happened back in the 80s and 90s. But there is a possibility. The bigger issue here though is that what if Russia continues and reinvades Ukraine at a later later date. In theory, they might just take part of Ukraine now and then take the rest of it in a few years when they're a little bit stronger and a lot of these economic sanctions have gone away. That is certainly possible, and it means that no country in Europe, and certainly Ukraine, is safe. This is one of the more likely scenarios because Russia already sees parts of Ukraine as its own country. Of course, it sees all of Ukraine as its own country, but it said before it actually invaded, two small parts of the eastern side of Ukraine wanted to be a part of Russia. And Russia basically said those two areas are separate nations and they have nothing to do with Ukraine. Obviously, this is wrong for a lot of different reasons, but the fact of the matter is that's what Russia said, and that's what Russia is going off of. Meaning all of the resources and the trade routes in that area are going to be completely compromised for Ukraine and the rest of Europe for that matter. They're not going to be able to use those trade routes, putting a further economic burden on those countries. Now, the third thing and most obvious to me is insurgency. So if Ukraine is completely split in half or Russia completely takes over the country itself, well, I don't think it'll be that easy. I think you're going to have insurgents and rebels that will continue to rise up against Russia for a long time. It is abundantly clear that Ukraine is super brave and super strong. They've been pushing back the Russian military for weeks now. And they're certainly not going to go down with a fight. So even if the Ukrainian government is compromised, individuals are going to continue to rise up, which is going to be a problem for Russia. It's going to be hard for them to set up a government and create systems if they're constantly having to fight a battle against rebels. That's costly. It's going to continue to cost them more when their economy is basically in shambles right now. The Russian ruble is worth less than 1 US cent. The Russian stock market isn't even open because it's tanking so hard. The Russian wealthy and oligarchs are losing their assets and money every single day. Regular consumers aren't really able to spend any of their money because major businesses that operate around the world are closing their doors in Russia. With all that being said, Russia simply just cannot afford to continue to be fighting a costly war in Ukraine. So even if they are able to take around half of the country and set it up for Russia, well, they're still going to be battling Ukrainian citizens almost every single day. Meaning you will never have peace in that side of Russia, which means over time, the Ukrainians that live there that do not want to become refugees or go over to the other half of Ukraine, well, they're going to keep fighting and peace will never be achieved. So eventually it's probably going to end up as its own country anyway, because you're going to have revolution after revolution, meaning a bigger military presence and again, more money. The fourth thing that this article talks about is the most serious and world-defining. Basically, it's NATO versus Russia. This would be an all-out war between the countries of NATO, like the United States and the United Kingdom, versus Russia. Ever since this conflict started, there has been a push from Ukraine and the rest of the world for NATO to basically join the fight. The Ukrainian president has called for a no-fly zone over Ukraine and has asked for even harsher sanctions. Now, the United States, to its credit, has put extreme sanctions on Russia at the moment. However, when it comes to sanctions, it's kind of up in the air on whether they actually work or not. Sanctions only really work if every single country on the planet is against that country that's being sanctioned. However, right now, we're not really seeing that. Yes, the United States has banned imports of Russian oil. So has pretty much every other country. That is Russia's main source of revenue. And we've targeted their central bank and the businesses that function out of Russia. However, if there's still other countries that are willing to buy Russian oil or Russian goods and services, then it doesn't really matter. Putin's war and Russia's war is still being funded. And right now, China is still buying a ton of Russian goods and services. That's a problem because Russia is not running out of funds as of yet. Sure, their economy is hurting bad because their major buyers have completely left the table, but China is still around. And it's not just China. There's other countries too that are still buying things from Russia. So this has led a lot of experts to say, should NATO actually step in and go into all-out war with Russia? Now, not only would this have disastrous effects on humanity, it would have catastrophic effects on worldwide economies. The United States right now is in a fragile place, both politically and financially, and we don't really have a ton of money to fight a worldwide war against Russia. Wars are nothing but expensive and costly. Actually putting troops in Ukraine and enforcing a no-fly zone is not something the United States is willing to do right now. In fact, no country is willing to do this at this point. However, they might not really have a choice if Russia continues to take more and more of Ukraine and decides that it's going to start attacking neighboring countries and invading those countries. Well, because of Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the United States has no choice. They're going to have to go to war with Russia and defend the NATO territories. This would basically mean that the supply chain issues in the United States would further deteriorate, because now all of the countries that we ally with are having a harder time getting everything into our country because they have to spend so much on this war with Russia. In addition, now we're not going to get a single thing from Russia. They're not going to supply us with natural gas and wheat and any of these other resources if we're actively fighting them in a war. With those two things being said, inflation is going to rapidly rise in the United States. Energy accounts for around 1/3 of the consumer price index, the report that basically measures how inflation is fluctuating on a month-by-month basis. With the United States having to put a lot of its oil and oil reserves into Europe to fight this war with Russia, and companies not able to get things into the United States and consumers not able to buy oil themselves, right now the price of oil is around $130 per barrel. We could see it double and even triple if we have an all-out war. And of course, we don't know how long that would take. That could take years for us to resolve, and it could ultimately mean that the United States falls as the world's dominant superpower. Right now, China isn't extremely against what Russia is doing. I mean, they don't love it, but at the end of the day, they may end up supporting Russia, which would basically create a world war. And China is a rising superpower, and they might end up overtaking us if they were to win that conflict. But even if that didn't happen, and the United States and the rest of the NATO countries end up pushing Russia back, that's going to have long-lasting effects on our world economy and inflation here at home. And then number 5, this article talks about a miracle for Ukraine. They're able to actually push back the Russian forces and completely take back their country. This is, of course, the best possible situation. Russia basically just gives up and says, fine, you can be your own country, do your own thing. Obviously, that would mean the end of the war. Economic sanctions would probably still exist against Russia, so the Russian economy is going to continue to drop. However, the worldwide economy doesn't have to put so many resources in defending Ukraine or into getting more oil into our country, because eventually those economic sanctions on Russia are going to disappear. Now, I will say this is not without no consequences altogether, because there was just a war. Even if Russia decides to leave, they are still a bordering country with Ukraine. That means there's gonna be some animosity in that region, and all of the countries like the United States and UK and France that told Putin and the Russian government to not invade Ukraine, well, they're gonna have some harsh feelings as well. That's going to continue for a while, and not to mention the Russian citizens who are basically starting to hate their own government and hate the rest of the world because they're facing such economic challenges right now. No matter what the situation, this is going to lead to some pretty big changes across the world. I mean, obviously the best possible situation is for this war in Ukraine to end as soon as possible. Lives are being lost senselessly. No matter how much money is lost here, you can always make more money. However, those lives that are lost, you can't get that back. So the rest of the world in the United States is hopeful that the people of Ukraine can fight back and actually push Russia out of the country. At this point though, it's not looking like that's going to be possible. Russia is throwing pretty much everything they have at Ukraine right now, and they don't really care how much they lose. They just want Ukraine. The opposite happens, and they're able to completely take over Ukraine. Well, that means they're going to get all of Ukraine's resources, and you're also going to have Russia bordering some other NATO nations. They might not like that either, which means further conflict could happen this year or in the future. And a victory for Russia would basically mean that their confidence is bolstered. They were able to take over an entire country. All of its economic resources and its people are now under Russian control. And most likely, eventually they're only going to want more. Now, this is a super scary situation, but like I said, there is hope. Hope that the economic sanctions actually work, and hope that the entire rest of the world fights back against Russia, at least in a financial sense. And hope that Ukraine actually pushes back Russia and diplomatic solutions can be found. That is still all on the table. Like I said, it would not only save lives, but it will also save a lot of economic hurt. Meaning the rippling waves from this war and potential further conflicts and economic fallout might not be as big. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. What do you think about these 5 possible outcomes for the war between Russia and Ukraine? Do you think that one is way more likely than the other? Or do you think that there is a totally different outcome that could be coming that this article did not address? Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date with all of the top business and financial news from around the country, our team puts together a free daily newsletter, and you can subscribe to it by clicking the link in this corner right here. And if you want to stay up to date with me and everything else happening in the business and financial world, I'm putting out uploads 7 days a week over here on this channel, and I've actually got another update ready for you right here, so be sure to check that out before you go. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.